All right. Hi, everybody. You can see me. I can't see you. So welcome to live TV from Islesboro. My name's Patrick O'Bannon. I think everybody knows who I am. I'm president of the Islesboro Historical Society, and I look very weird with my glasses reflecting, so we'll do that. This is going to be an experiment tonight. We decided we would try something called Ask a Historian, where we solicited some questions from people in the community about their houses, their neighborhoods, their families. And I spent a little time doing some research, and we're going to try and address some of those questions. Hopefully this will spark some of you to have additional questions, and some of you who contributed questions will be very disappointed that we won't get to them tonight, but we plan to do this again, so don't give up hope. A couple of housekeeping tips before we get started. At the bottom of the screen of your screen, if you roll your cursor to the bottom of your screen, you will see a little symbol that says Q&A. And if you have questions that you want me to try and answer, please post them in the Q&A box. You can click on that, it'll open up and you can put your question in there, and we will get to it. Mike Hutcherson is ably assisting me here and keeping me from making a complete fool of myself. So he will keep tabs on the Q&A questions. There's also a chat symbol down there that you can also use, and you can raise your hand if you would like to actually say something. But with 50 people on the call, it's probably going to be a little difficult to have folks chiming in and chatting. So you're going to have to just deal with me mostly. I'm hoping that this will run about an hour, maybe an hour and a half. And with no further ado, when I put out a request for questions, there were two topics that had multiple requests. And so I decided I would do those two first. The first of these has to do with the origin of the term Guinea in the middle of the island, the neighborhood in the center of the island. And where does Guinea come from? So I'm going to try and address that. Somebody already asked about where does Pripyat come from, which is the logical next question. And I can touch base on that. What I know off the top of my head, when we get through with Guinea, I can touch base with Pripyat. But in the meantime, Guinea, I have heard two principal stories as to where the term Guinea comes from. The first goes something like this. An old mariner is walking along the road. He bumps into a neighbor. The neighbor asks him where he's been. He says, "Oh, I've been down to Guinea." The second, which is kind of a variation on that story, has a bunch of guys sitting around in the Pendleton store that was located in Guinea. And they were sitting around one evening trying to figure out what they were going to call the neighborhood. They thought the neighborhood needed a name. And somebody suggested Guinea, and the name stuck. There is no conclusive evidence as to why Guinea is named Guinea. It's interesting that in the 1893 Pharaoh history, there is no mention of Guinea, which I find curious, but Pharaoh is not exactly a completely objective historian. He has biases and things get left out of his account. So he may have just decided he didn't want to include that explanation for the neighborhood. The other interesting thing is that in the 1983 history, while there is a discussion of the neighborhood, there's no discussion of where the name comes from. So roughly defined, and people will probably correct me on this, I sort of think of Guinea as extending from pretty much where the Historical Society building is down to where the old Pendleton store was located in Guinea. sort of at the southern end would be sort of at where the Pendleton properties end in the neighborhood. It includes the old F.S. Pendleton and Company store. It includes the present library. It includes the Pendleton School that's now the double door gallery. So it's a little center of town. Mike, do you want to go to the first image? So this is from the Historical Society, basically, looking south down Main Road. The road that's going off to your right is West Shore. And you're looking into the heart of Guinea, probably around, I don't know, 1910, 1911, something like that. You will notice several things right of way. There are not very many houses on the east side of the road, and there are not very many trees. The two houses in the foreground, both are still standing, as is the one in the middle foreground on the right-hand side of the road. What you'll also see in this image is a wood plank sidewalk on the west side of the road and somebody with a bicycle in the middle of the road. The utility poles are probably telephone and telegraph. Telephone lines go into onto the island in some rudimentary fashion as early as the 1890s. But I don't think there's much electricity until after the 1920s. So I suspect this is telephone lines. But this is Guinea. Go to the next shot, Mike. This is also Guinea. This is looking west along Hughes Point Road. This was for a teachers' convention, as I understand it. And so these are all ladies and a few men who are either staying at the hotel on Hughes Point or have just come in on a steamer, and they are headed for probably the town hall where there is supposed to be a teachers' convention. Although I suppose they could be heading to the Pendleton School across from the library. Some of these buildings are still here. Some are still standing. I know for a fact, and I know people are looking at this going, oh, it must be from 1892. I know it's later than 1892 because my house is in the middle of the photo, and I know that building was built in 1902, so it's later than that. But again, you see not a lot of trees, a scattering of houses, and a lot of open landscape. So we can take the images off if we want and just go back to my bald head. When I tried to start figuring out where the term Guinea came from, I was looking at what are all the sources for the term, and there's a British coin that's a pound and a shilling. That didn't seem to make much sense. It's a derogatory term for Italians, but there's no evidence of there being Italians on the island or in that neighborhood, so that didn't make any sense. It's a country in Africa that was very much associated with the transatlantic slave trade. And because Guinea on Islesboro refers to a geographic place, my guess is that they were using the reference to the place in Africa to refer to the place on the island. Were islanders involved in the transatlantic slave trade? Is that what's going on? We don't know. I haven't seen any evidence to that effect. But there's a couple of things that are sort of interesting about that, in that, remember that Islesboro was settled in the 1760s. There's not much going on here until after the British leave Castine in 1783. So the community is really just getting going in the 1780s and 1790s. In 1808, Congress prohibited the importation of slaves into the United States, which didn't stop illegal imports of enslaved Africans, and it didn't stop American vessels from carrying slaves elsewhere. So there was plenty of opportunity for slave voyages to be continuing after 1808. In 1820, however, Congress declared participation in the slave trade to be piracy and punishable by death. So it seems fairly likely that there's not that many upstanding Islesboro mariners engaged in the slave trade after 1820, if they were engaged at all. And so the other thing that's important about all this is that despite the law, between 1808 and 1860, something like a third of the slave ships that were owned, built, or outfitted were owned, built, or outfitted by Americans. So we were actively engaged in the transatlantic slave trade, carrying people to the West Indies, Cuba, and Brazil, even if we weren't importing people into the United States after 1808. The other story has to do with the Pendleton store. And Mike, why don't we go to that image? So this is the early version of FS Pendleton and Company in Guinea. This store was built in 1880. If you look at the building on the left, it looks kind of like it was a house that's been converted. There's some outbuildings, there's a wagon shed, there's what looks like probably a stable on the right. And go to the next image. This is the same property. The original store is the gable end on the right-hand side of the photo that you see. The big hipped roof building is all an addition that fronted right out onto the street. I do not know the date of the addition, but this is the store that most people know of and think of when they think of the Guinea Pendleton store. This is a wonderful photo. I love this photo. You can see the wash tubs, galvanized metal wash tubs hanging in the upstairs window. And the signboard is in the Historical Society still. It was the largest store on the island. And we can take this down now if you want. When Dark Harbor was being developed in the 1880s and 1890s, there was no store down there. The grocery store in Dark Harbor dates from about 1904, 1905. I have a theory, I have a thought that possibly the origins of Guinea have to do with the fact that if you were going to the largest store on the island and you lived in Dark Harbor or you lived up island north of the Narrows, it was a long way to get to the center of the island, to get to the FS Pendleton and Company store. And for some people, that probably felt like making the trip to Guinea, a long trip to try and get your groceries. So probably other people have other stories. I don't think we're ever going to know conclusively how Guinea got its name. I wish we did know. And who knows, maybe somebody will have chapter and verse on it here tonight or in the future. We'll keep looking and see what we can find out. But at the moment, that's what we've got. So the second question that had two people who wanted to know about it had to do with the presence of tidal mills on the island. And Michael, if we can go to the map. This is a very interesting map that we discovered recently. It was prepared in 1795 by Samuel Warren. It was done at a point in time where all of the towns in the Maine district of Massachusetts were having to submit maps of their boundaries. So this is Islesboro circa 1795. The left-hand square, which is at Sabbath Day Harbor, lists a sawmill within that square. The right-hand square, which is at Mill Creek, lists a grist mill. So we know, and we have other evidence that there were mills in both of those locations. So we know that there were at least two tidal mills on the island. I've recently been working on deeds referencing the area around the Meadow Pond. And if you get back into the 1840s and 1850s, Meadow Pond is consistently referred to as the mill pond. So it's possible that there was another mill up there, although I haven't seen any accounts of it. What I know was going on Meadow Pond was ice cutting on a commercial basis. And there are stories that there was a tannery up there as well. There are some pits between the outlet of the pond and West Bay that suggests that maybe there was a tannery in process up there. I don't know very much about the Mill Creek property. The map shows it as a grist mill. It seems to be tied in with the little hamlet that developed around Mill Creek. The bridge is referred to quite early in the deeds, back into the 1830s. There are a series of stores that were occupied, that sat on the, what would it be, the northwest corner of the bridge. You can see the pilings at low tide. That store goes back into the 1860s and was consistently run by Gilkeys and Hatches. And it ran at least up into the 1890s and probably later than that. The tidal mill at Sabbath Day Harbor, when you walk out on the trail there, you can actually see the remains of the mill dam at low tide. And that is a better documented property. We know that in 1785, the area was sold to Peter Coombs. And in 1791, Peter Coombs sold 100 acres with a quarter interest in the sawmill to Miguel Parker. That same year, Peter Woodward, who was also an early landowner up in that area, sold his quarter interest in the sawmill to a guy named John Brown. The following year, John Brown sold his interest to Oliver Mann and Noah Dodge. So we know there's a sawmill there by 1791, and it may have been as early as 1785, and it clearly is there, you know, when Warren draws his map in 1795. So what is a tidal mill? Let's go to the next image here, Michael. This is not Islesboro. This is a schematic drawing. A tidal mill uses a dam, and the arrows at the bottom of the drawing show where the dam here is blocking off Mill Cove Pond, which is the big blob in the middle of the drawing, from Huntington Harbor down below. So there is a dam built across that cuts off this pond. There is a gate in the middle of the dam where the bottom arrow is, that is usually a swing gate. And when it's hinged, and it's like the leaves of a door, so when the tide is coming in, the gate swings open and the water flows into the mill pond. When the tide turns and begins to flow out, the gate closes and traps the water in the mill pond. The water is then directed through the water wheel at the mill and can be used for a sawmill or a grist mill or whatever you have in mind. So that's how they work. Essentially, it's a gate in a dam. It swings open, the water goes in, it swings closed, the water is trapped, and you put it through the mill and use it to generate power. Let's go to the next one, Mike. So this is a photo of a tidal mill in Quincy, Massachusetts. The mill is on the right. It's standing up on granite blocks or sandstone blocks. You're looking downstream. So you're in the mill, you're standing in the mill pond here. You can see the log structure in the middle, the two log walls. That's where the gates would have been. So when the water is coming upstream, when the tide is flowing, the gates open, the water flows into the mill pond. When the tide turns, the gates close as the water pushes them out. the water's trapped in the mill pond and you have enough water to run your wheel in the mill on the right. So we know that we have 2 tidal mills as early as 1795. We may have a 3rd one at Meadow Pond, but we don't know yet. And that's what we've got there. I see a question. Hang on a sec. Whoops. Carrie Reed is wondering where the store was located. The store at Mill Creek was, if you are headed towards the ferry from the community center, when you go across the bridge on the left side of your car, on the far side of the creek, you at low tide, you will see a series of cut off pilings in the mud, and that's where the store stood. The Pendleton store. The Pendleton store. The Pendleton store was on the west side of Main Road, across the street from, I believe it's the Yellow House there in Guinea. It sat right up against the highway. And it closed in the 70s, finally, 1970s, when Donnie Pendleton and Jack Coffin built the grocery store that became and is now the town office. And my understanding is that the property was sold to people who owned the house on the other side of the road, and they decided to knock the building down. It was apparently in bad shape, but it was demolished at some point in the late 70s or early 80s, perhaps. So that's what I've got for tidal mills. We have plenty of time here. And one of the other questions that was asked had to do with the history of Billy Shore. And I don't have a lot of images for this, but I think all of you probably know Billy Shore. If you turn at Durkee's and go down to Ryder's Cove, when you get to the end of the road there's a right-hand turn that puts you onto Billy Shore Road. And it winds all the way south to, depending on who you are, Russell Point or Fire Island or Coombs Point, which is at the end of Billy Shore Road. So there are a whole series of small cottages, summer camps, lining along Billy Shore Road. And that development all takes place in the 1880s, or begins in the 1880s, and is the result of 3 guys. The north end of Billy Shore, the very north end of Billy Shore, is owned originally by Benjamin Ryder. Benjamin Ryder owns the hotel that's at Ryder's Cove. And in 1880, a year before his death, and he's in his mid-60s at that point, he begins to subdivide his property and to sell it off into lots for cottages. So he owns the hotel, which is very popular with people who are coming down for weekends by steamer from Bangor. And he has room for 100 people in the hotel, as I understand it. But he decides he's going to start selling off little tiny lots. They sell for about 25 bucks and are very small. And he starts selling those off for people to build their own cottages. The next guy and in 1881, the year after he starts doing that, the town builds Billy Shore Road. It doesn't go all the way to the end where it does now, but they start building Billy Shore Road. Pretty much immediately, the next owner to the south along the waterfront there, who is a guy named Solomon P. Coombs, decides that he's going to subdivide his waterfront property, take advantage of the new town road, take advantage of the steamer that comes into Riders Cove and the hotel and the social life that's going on at the hotel. And he begins to subdivide his property up into small lots and selling it off to folks. One of the things that's interesting with Coombs's property is that some of what he subdivides, he sells in bigger chunks to people who are clearly land speculators in Bangor, who then turn around and subdivide into even smaller pieces and are selling to people who are building cottages. So there's sort of a land speculation thing going on there. Coombs's property extends down. If you know Billy Shore, it makes this big left-hand turn. Before you get to the left-hand turn, you cross out of Solomon Coombs's property and into his fourth cousin's property, William R. Billy Coombs, hence Billy Shore. Billy Coombs is a little bit younger than Ryder and Solomon Coombs. He's in his 50s. He's known as Uncle Billy to a lot of people. And he also begins to subdivide and sell off. As a result, the town extends the road down into his property. And his earliest sales are from the 1882, 1883. There are subdivision maps for his property that are dated 1902 and 1904, but he's clearly subdividing things before then. One of the things that's interesting about this is the subdivisions predate the extension of Billy Shore Road, because once the road is built, there are a whole series of deed transactions where people are trying to extend their property from their original back line west from the waterfront to get to the road. So there's a whole slew of 25 and 30 foot wide parcels, deep parcels, that are extending people's original cottage lot back to the road. So it's clearly a case of development sort of preceding infrastructure on some level, and then everybody trying to catch up with it. Go to the photo here, Mike. This is Billy Coombs and his wife, Ida. They're walking up what's known as Billy's Lane, which extended from their house, which is between Billy Shore and Main Road. It's a cellar hole now. And they're walking up from Billy Shore, or maybe they're walking down to Billy Shore. I don't know which way they're going. But this is the pair of them. Probably Billy dies in 1922. So this is probably another 1910, 1912 photo. And this may be my favorite photo in the whole Historical Society collection. I just love how this conveys life on the island and the old islanders. And you can see some gates and fences and other things in the background there. The interesting thing about Billy Shore is that most of the people who bought lots there came from Bangor, and Bangor there was a very thriving vacation trade going down to Islesboro by steamboat from Bangor and staying at the Riders Cove Hotel. At one point it was called the Seaside House. And that dates from the 1860s all the way up into the 1900s. So that by the 1880s, when Ryder and the two Coombses decided to start subdividing up and selling lots for vacationers to build cottages on, there's a good 20 years of history of Riders Cove being used for vacationers. And a lot of the people who buy down along Billy Shore are associated with the Bangor Theological Seminary. So there are a number of missionaries and ministers and religious types who buy property down along Billy Shore. Let's see. Somebody wants to know, okay, Pripyat. I need to go back to Pripyat, sorry. My understanding of Pripyat is that when they opened a post office at the north end of the island, there were several post offices on the island. There was a post office in Dark Harbor. There was a post office in the middle of the island. It was probably run out of the Pendleton store. There was a post office, Riders Cove, that was across the street from the hotel that was known as North Islesboro. When they decided to build another post office up in Pripyat, that neighborhood was generally known as North Islesboro. And the post office said, you can't have two North Islesboro post offices. And my understanding is that somebody in Washington, D.C., or somebody in a post office bureaucracy said, I have a name for you. Why don't you call it Pripyat? And Pripyat is apparently references to an area in the Ukraine or in Russia, a marshy area that was a geographical location. And so whoever was looking for the post office said, fine, no problem. So that's what I know about Pripyat. And possibly other people know other things. Let's see, Steve Miller, who lived in the two large houses on the top of the height of land visible from the Historical Society building in that early picture of Guinea. All right, so you're looking at the two houses. Yeah, Mike's circling one, and then the other one is to the right. Those are houses on County Road. The one on the right is, I believe, Bob Clayton's house now. It was built by the son-in-law of a Pendleton who was one of the Pendleton brothers' ship captains. The Pendletons had a very, very active and very large fleet of coastal schooners that they ran out of Brooklyn, New York, but there were four brothers involved in it. And they all have those big houses there in Guinea along Main Road. And this one was a son-in-law or a brother-in-law who was one of their captains. The other one on the left there is also associated with the Pendleton family. And I can't remember off the top of my head who owned that, but that whole stretch of County Road was Pendleton land until you get back pretty far down the road, and then it becomes really, really complicated. There's some Dodges in there, there's some Spriggs in there. It gets wrapped up into Hughes Point and Abrams Mountain. Abram is Abraham Dodge. It gets I'm still working on it. And I'm hoping to get it figured out one of these days. But those two houses are Pendleton houses. Let's see. Joe of Joe's Rock. I assume that Joe is Joseph Pendleton. That's my understanding. I haven't seen it specifically addressed as his, but the Pendletons had a lot of property on the east side of the island. And my understanding is that was Joseph Pendleton who had the rock and obviously a lot of land inland from there. There are lots of places on the island that are obviously named for folks who were early. I'm pulling up my spreadsheet to see if I can figure out Joe's Rock. Let's see. Yep, I'm not getting anything. Sorry, but I believe it's Joseph Pendleton. But there are a lot of places that are named for folks who were early settlers or lived for a long period of time. Charlotte's Cove is named for Charlotte Boardman. Interestingly enough, there are some other places that the names tend to stick around for a long period of time. Sabbath Day Harbor, which is sort of the north end of Riders Cove, has been Sabbath Day Harbor forever. Dark Harbor has been referred to as Dark Harbor is named on that 1795 map, long before there was any social development in Dark Harbor. Other places have names that go way back. Seal Harbor is on that 1795 map, although it's egregiously spelled Ciele. So there's some issues with some of the spelling on some of this stuff. I want to talk a little bit. I want to hold this to around an hour, and we can, if people have questions and want to chime in on the Q&A or raise their hand or whatever, that's fine. One of the questions that I received when I was soliciting interest had to do with lime quarries on the island. And I am up to my ears in lime quarries at this point. There were two that I know of. One is at Warren's Landing up in Pripet. Some of you may know the area as Joint Point. I don't know a whole lot about that quarry. It is later than the earlier quarry, and the earlier quarry is located off of Keller Point Road and dates to the early 1850s, and was developed by the Kellers, Samuel T. Keller particularly, who was a merchant from Camden who bought property over here, bought up some of the old Williams property. He was in business with a number of people from Rockland and Lincolnville who had experience with lime quarries. And that operation ran into the 1880s. It went bankrupt a couple of times, but because it went bankrupt, there are court cases and levies for taxes and stuff like that. And there was a wharf, there was a storehouse, there were tenement houses, which makes you think that there were people living there, workers living on site. There was quite a little operation going on there. Let's see. Northeast part of Lime Island. That's there are lime quarries all over the place, and lime kilns. You're burning the lime to turn it into lime that you can use in making mortar for stonework. It's also used for fertilizer. Let's see. Job's Island. Job's Island is named for Job Pendleton, who is one of the early Pendletons who settles on Islesboro. I believe Job is the son of William Pendleton, who originally has the entire south end of the island. And William, it's interesting, there are two sets of Pendletons. I'm looking up Job right now, sorry. There are two sets of Pendletons, and they're sort of distant cousins. The Pendletons come from Stonington, Connecticut area. Yeah, Job Pendleton is William Pendleton's son. And he lived from 1782 to 1847. And he apparently had a house out on Job's Island. Let's see. Any interesting Revolutionary War history? Well, there's some very interesting Revolutionary War history. Islesboro is settled in the 1760s. The war starts. There are maybe 10 families, a dozen families out here. They are pioneers at that point. In 1779, the British take Castine on the east side of the bay, and they start fortifying it. They are building a fort. The Americans, Massachusetts, decides that they can't have this happen. Remember that Maine is part of Massachusetts at this point. And they raise a large fleet and a sizable force of men and sail up and are going to capture the fort from the British, something like 40 ships. They get here in July of 1779. They diddle around debating who's in charge. Eventually they land at Castine. They get to the fort. They storm the heights. They get, which is a very dramatic military action because they're basically going straight up a cliff. They get to the fort, which is not done. And rather than seize the fort, they stop and start digging in. The British general who's in charge of the fort said he was going to fire one volley and lower the flag. When the Americans don't do that, he starts digging in and building better defenses. The Americans start to lay siege to the place. And about a month later, a very large British fleet comes sailing up the bay. And every one of the 40 American ships is either scuttled or sunk by the British. And the crews and the soldiers all flee overland down south back to Portland area and on into Massachusetts proper. It is the largest American naval defeat prior to Pearl Harbor. What it means, though, is that for the next 4 years until the Treaty of Paris in 1783 that ends the war, is that there is a British army in Castine. And Islesboro is suitable raiding territory for them. There are fights back and forth. There are open boats rowing around with armed parties from both sides. It's a very difficult time to be out here. There are stories of people who were impressed into privateers from the island. There are stories of people whose farms were raided out here by the British. There are other people who were raided by American privateers. This was no man's land. So it was very awkward being out here. What's really interesting, though, is I was doing some work at Fort George over in Castine, the British post, and the British Army, being the British Army, kept very thorough records. And after the defeat of the American force from Massachusetts, the British worked to finish the fort and make it a very good fortification. And there are a number of very familiar Islesboro names who worked for the British and collected cash wages for helping on the fort. So as I said, they were in a very awkward situation over here, and I suppose it was just as easy to make a little money out of it. Let's see, was there a quarry at Marshall Cove just up the hill on the right from the beach? Not that I know of. I know that there's some gravel pits and other stuff up in there, but I don't know of another quarry up there. There are lots of, I'm still working on what do you want to call it? Mining history. I know that there was a mining operation on the east side, just south of Charlotte's Cove, off of East Shore Drive. And that's recorded in the deeds. I have not seen anything up at Marshall Cove that would suggest there was an ongoing operation up there, but obviously there's some stuff that happens contemporaneous now, currently. Was the island denuded of trees to fuel the lime quarries? No. The island was denuded of trees because timber was a cash crop. And you could cut trees and sell the firewood to be shipped down to Boston and southern New England for warming people's houses and businesses. Southern New England by the 1760s and 1770s was pretty much cut over, not very many trees. And wood was the fuel of choice. And so you had to start looking for wood. If you're a new settler on Islesboro, you've got plenty of trees and not a lot to do with them. And so they were sold as a cash crop to be shipped south. And in fact, there's a really interesting court case from the 1780s where the case all hinges around somebody cutting trees for firewood on land that's not his. He went too far to the east. And there are depositions about who's cutting where and what are they doing with the trees and what's going on with all of that. So the island is denuded of trees for firewood, for export firewood. It's also stripped in order to create farmland for people. And then ultimately a lot of it gets cut for pasture. But yeah, in the photos from the turn of the century, the island is pretty much stripped bare. It was interesting when I first got started on island history. I was looking at postcards and other historic photos, and I was thinking, well, I'll just ride around on my bicycle and I'll figure out where these views are and I'll replicate these views, and we'll do one of those Islesboro Then and Now books. And I realized that Islesboro Now was just going to be a wall of trees that didn't have any connection to the historic views. Let's see. Yeah, Laura is pointing out that there's an excellent novel by Bernard Cornwell called The Fort, which talks about the Castine adventure. It's fiction, but it's historical fiction, and he does a pretty good job of being as accurate as he can. One of the sidebars to that whole story is that the Continental officer or the Massachusetts officer who's in charge of the artillery is Paul Revere. And Paul Revere ends up in a world of trouble at the end of all of this because he's accused of not fulfilling his duty very well. And it's sort of a stain on his reputation at some point. Let's see. Oh, somebody I know is wondering where most of the ship captain's houses located on the east side of the island. That's a really great question. One of the things I'm really interested in is why people built their houses where they built them. If you are looking at the oldest houses on the island, and there's a handful that go back to the 18th century, and there's a fair number that probably go back to the first half of the 19th century, they're not on the water. They are up along the ridge lines, along the road lines. And the roads are very, very old. The roads are laid out quite early. Main Road, Pendleton Point Road, West Shore Road, what do you call it? Mill Creek Road. Those all exist very early. And I think that there is a very clear understanding of environment and the environment and prevailing winds and where you want to build your house so that you're not confronted by prevailing winds. If you look around at houses, those that aren't fronting right on the road often have their front door facing south so that they get a little bit of sun in the wintertime. People tend to, there are a lot of houses on the east side of the island, along Main Road and Pendleton Point Road. So you're on the backside of the ridge from prevailing winds that come in from the northwest in the wintertime. It gives you a little bit of shelter. I have not yet figured out why there were a series of old houses on West Shore Drive, or West Bay Drive rather, because those buildings, while they were up from the water, face northwest and get quite a handful of weather during the wintertime. But I think what happens is people built their houses up towards the roads, which are built away from the water, and then they worked down on the water, fishing or as sailors or whatever. I do know one story, the house that's being renovated at the Y, on the east side of the Y, that is an old Ryder house. And I was told at some point that that house dates from the late 1840s, early 1850s, and that it was built at the insistence of the wife, who they had been living down at the cove, down on the water, and they lost 4 children under the age of 8 to cholera in the space of about 18 months. And the story that someone told me was that she said, "We're not living down here anymore with the wet air and the miasmas and the vapors that are causing sickness. You need to build me another house that's up off the waterfront." Let's see. Islesboro fish weirs. Oh, that would be interesting. Yikes. There are a bunch of them, and the deeds often reserve the salmon privilege to the guy who's selling to somebody later on. Laura's wondering, was the tree-covered island what attracted the investors, or once it was denuded? Okay, so the trees are gone by the time the Islesboro Land and Improvement Company gets involved. They're the ones who developed the island and sort of the Dark Harbor, community down there. They buy up a huge amount of land all over the island. They have the bluff out where Travolta's place is. They have all of Keller Point. They have all of the west side of the Meadow Pond, and they're trying to build a vacation community to sort of rival Bar Harbor and what was also happening on North Haven. The trees are attractive, and they try and preserve the trees that are there. There's a great set of deeds where 3 or 4 of the people who have cottages fronting out onto Gilkey's Harbor outpay a lumber company who wants to buy the timber rights on Spruce Island. And these people who look out on Spruce Island offer more money to the fellow who owns Spruce Island, Mr. Grindle, so that he won't sell the timber rights. So there's some effort clearly to protect the trees and protect the views. But I think, there are plenty of old photos from the time of the development of the cottages that just show vast open spaces as well. Will is wondering about Native people getting pushed out and when. I don't know a whole lot about this. I've been trying to learn more about it. The Native Americans tended to use the islands as summer camps. They would come down and stay on the islands and fish and collect shellfish during the summertime. Shell middens, there are shell middens on the island, which are places where people shucked clams and threw the shells away for hundreds and thousands of years. I don't know that there was permanent settlement out here. The earliest written account of Islesboro that I've seen that really is specifically Islesboro and is not just an expedition going up the Penobscot is an account of an expedition during King Philip's War. Well, actually, it's later than King Philip's War. It's in the 1690s, and a famous Indian fighter from southern New England, a guy named Benjamin Church, leads an expedition up here, and he lands on Acre Island and encounters some Native American women and I believe some French men. And remember, the French are in Castine at this point. They flee, and he chases them, and they get across from Acre to Islesboro proper, where there are suddenly a lot of Native Americans sort of daring him to come on over. And he declines and takes what he can from what appear to have been temporary camps on Acre, some hides and stuff like that, and leaves. But that seems to be the first sort of, that's the closest Native American history I've seen that's clearly documented. There are some wonderful Native American stories, mythic stories about Glooskap, who was the sort of Penobscot mythic figure, sort of a Paul Bunyan-ish type of figure. And he's hunting moose on Cape Rozier, and he has a dog with him, and the dog is splashing around in the bay. And this is a giant person. And he kills the moose and the moose calf, dresses the carcasses and throws the entrails to his dog. And the entrails land on Islesboro, where the dog eats some and leaves some. And supposedly those entrails are the quartz outcroppings that are visible down at Town Beach. I think that when you look at these stories, there are a whole series of stories that provide very specific geographic locations. And I have a sense that these are navigational aids for people who are paddling from one place to another. And so you're looking for the moose entrails at the end of the island because they will give you the next connection on your trip to get to where your portage is across Cape Rozier or wherever you're going. I've reached out to the Penobscot to see if they have any tradition of this. And I'm probably getting into areas that they would prefer not to talk about. So I haven't had any feedback on that, but I want to continue to explore that some. Were there wolves on the island? Probably, but I don't really know. What I know that's very interesting is there were definitely brown-tailed moths on the island. If you go back through the old town reports, you can see that they were spending money to try and eradicate brown-tailed moths around 1900. So those little boogers are not something that's brand new. Ted Pendleton says Shuba Williams interacted with the Terratines when he first arrived. They didn't live here and only came in summers to fish and to party. Yeah, I think coming down here in the summertime would have been standard part of the cyclical nature of living off the land in those days. If you were Native American, in the winter you went back inland and you went hunting for moose and deer. It was easier to hunt moose when there was snow because it was easier to track them and to catch them. So you came to the coast in the summer and then you went back inland during the winter. Let's see. Flat Island has a British soldier buried there. I've heard this too. Do we know that that's really true, or is that just a story? And oh, thank you. You're welcome. The other thing to keep in mind about Castine is that the British took it again during the War of 1812 and were there for a period of time, a couple of years. The old fort was in disarray and they spent a fair amount of time trying to fix it. There is a house up in Pripet that is known locally as the Cannonball House, and supposedly was damaged in 1812. It's possible. There was an American battery at Castine that fired a couple of salvos at the British when they came up the bay, and then they blew up their magazine and took off. So it's quite possible that a cannonball made it across the bay. They certainly weren't aiming at the house. The smoothbore cannons that you see in sort of the Revolutionary Napoleonic War of 1812 time, there's a real reason that when you have these naval battles, they get in right close to each other. It's because the effective range on these things of hitting what you're aiming at is maybe 200 or 300 yards. They are notoriously inaccurate. Oh, cool. Ted, I'll have to get you to take me out to Flat Island. It's 8 o'clock. I'm going to wrap this up now. It's water, not vodka. I would love to do this some more. If you have specific topics that you would like me to explore, you can email me at pobannon5@gmail.com, or you can stop me on the street. I'm happy to add some more questions and try and answer them. We've had some other questions that came in, including specific houses. I've been trying to answer the specific houses, just getting back to the folks who were interested. But there's some that might be interesting to a larger group. And let's see, we're just getting thank yous now. So with that, I appreciate everybody who attended. We had 55 some attendees here, which is awesome. If you enjoyed this, if you want to see more of it, let us know. I hope to do at least one more before, in April, and maybe one in May. And then at that point, summer takes over and God knows what's going to happen. But also it would be really nice if you like this and you're interested in island history, that you join the Islesboro Historical Society. We'll be sending out our mailing for renewals of membership in early May. We have a website and we're working on a new web page, and that has a PayPal link on it. So we've tried to make it as easy for you to give us money as it possibly can be. And with that, thanks so much for attending. I really appreciate it. And we look forward to talking to you next time. Thanks a lot, everybody. Bye-bye.